Okay, hello everybody and welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com and I'm joined today by Kim Congleton of Fastpath for a session on NAV Audit Trail Best Practices. It's great to welcome Kim. She's a first-time presenter with the MSCW audience. And as we get started, please know that you can add your feedback and ask questions during today's event. You can use the Q&A block that you should see to the right of the main presentation window. Feel free to ask your questions at any time. I know Kim will be leaving a few minutes at the end to get to those. We also wanted to start off with a poll question just to get a better sense of who in the audience is working with what version of NAV, and we'll just leave that open for a few moments here just to get a little bit of feedback Kim will be using just to sort of inform the session today. So without any further delay, please allow me to welcome Kim Congleton to start things off. Kim.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. As Jason said, my name is Kim Congleton, and I have been working with Dynamics NAV for about 12 years now. I've worked in many roles. I've been a consultant, an implementer, a developer, a solution architect. So I've seen all aspects of Dynamics NAV, worked quite a bit with setting up security inside of NAV for different implementations. So that's a little bit about my experience with NAV. I've worked on 2009, 4, 2013, 2015, 2016. I'm a frequent speaker at Summit and Convergence. I am a NAVUG board member and programming committee member, and I am the director of sales for Fastpath. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a couple of things around audit trails. And we're going to talk about how to determine what to audit. We're going to talk about setting up audit trails inside of NAV using the standard change log. We're going to talk about the different tools that are out there. We'll talk about the pitfalls and practices to avoid. So things to consider when you are using the NAV change log. And then what do you do with the audit data after you collect it? And that's kind of a big one because a lot of times we'll turn on audit trails and then we forget to actually review the data or have some sort of data retention policy. So we'll go through all of those things today. Kind of the first thing that we want to start with, and one of the most critical things when you're looking at audit trails and whether you need to use them, is determining what to audit. So when you look at your company at a high level, you want to look at what's your organizational risk. So if you kind of think of it like securing your home, the obvious thing that you're going to do first is lock your doors and windows. That's really obvious. Those are easy, quick wins. You know, you're not really going to worry about somebody, you know, rappelling through a skylight in your second floor, the second floor of your house, or scaling down your chimney. You know, it's the same thing with business. Usually you want to focus on controls around cash and cash management, issuance of payments, and receipt of cash. Those are the first kinds of things you're going to want to look at. You know, controls around assets, inventory, and credit issuance, those are also important, but they're usually going to come after cash, and they can vary widely based on the industry that you're in. So unless you're a company with highly sought after inventory, like, you know, for example, I don't know, Apple or Heineken or somewhere like that, where somebody's really going to want to go out, maybe, you know, take an iPhone and sell it on eBay real quick, it may not be something that you want to do first. It may be something that you want to tackle as a second phase. It's really critical that you look at, as an organization, where is my risk? Is it financial? Is it organizational? Is it physical? And what's most probable to happen? You know, are you worrying about things that there really is no probability for those to happen? If you focus on vendors and purchase orders, that may be where your biggest risk is. Because if you, for example, have the same person that can set up a vendor, being able to create a purchase order and being able to pay that purchase order, that's a huge risk. The next thing that we kind of want to talk about and that you want to look at is segregation of duties. So segregation of duties can have a huge effect on whether you have to audit audit some things. So segregation of duties and audit trails kind of go hand in hand. When you're looking at segregation of duties, if you have really great security and segregation of duties, audit trails may not be as big of a need for you. And when we talk about segregation of duties, what we talk about is making sure that if somebody can enter a vendor and they can create a purchase order, really having some mitigations in place to limit that impact. Now, a lot of small companies are not going to be able to say, I'm only going to have one person that can enter a vendor, and I'm only going to have one person that can create a purchase order. In a lot of places, that's not possible. So what you have to do is make sure that you really have some good processes in place that will allow you to limit your risk. So for example, if somebody can enter a vendor, maybe you have a process where there's dual approvals that are involved. So one person can enter that vendor, maybe they block that vendor, then it's somebody else's job to go in, review that vendor, make sure that the address is a real address, make sure that it's really a real vendor, and then maybe they unblock that vendor and now that vendor can be used. The other piece of that as well would be the controls you have around purchase orders. So maybe you have an approval process for large purchase orders so that somebody is looking at things and making sure that things seem like they're on the up and up. So with less segregation of duties, where you can't really keep those two functions separate, you may want to look at audit trails. And then putting those in place, it's going to be really important to review, is there anything that looks unusual? Is there anything that looks suspicious? Because it's really looking at that data that you're tracking and looking at, are there any red flags that go up when you look at that data? And then there's also other processes that you want to have in place. I was on a webinar one time with Mark Polino. He does a lot of our webinars as well. And he was talking about a car dealership where it was really small, family-run business. They had a couple of employees. One of the employees was the accounting manager, and she did all of the purchase orders and things for them. And she never took a vacation. And so for 10 years, she never took a vacation. When she finally took a vacation, the person that was taking over for her noticed some suspicious activities, and it ended up that the person had been actually embezzling from the company for the last 10 years. But it's some of those things like other processes that you don't think about, like making sure that somebody takes a mandatory vacation. So that somebody else actually does their job and can kind of look at things. It's things like that that are something that you'll combine with not only segregation of duties and audit trails and outside processes. So it's kind of that combination of all of those things that will give you, a secure environment where you're managing your risk. Then the other thing that you want to look at is high dollar impact. So, look at the types of transactions that are happening in your system. If it's transaction-based, look at if there's already a report so that you don't need to audit transactions. Transactions, when you decide to audit transactions, it can get really cumbersome and it can really tax the performance of your system. If there's already a built-in tracking for those debits and credits going out, you don't need to audit. You don't need to audit those. You just need to make sure that you're reviewing the reports of those transactions so you're looking at it. And then you really want to look at, the higher the dollar impact, that's what's going to determine what you audit. If things are really a lower dollar impact, is it something that you really want to spend your time looking at? So just make sure you identify those areas in your companies. The next thing, obviously, is audit requirements. So if you are a public company, obviously, if your SOX have to be SOX compliant or HIPAA, those are things that you'll want to make sure that you're tracking based on what those requirements are. The other part where you may want to where you may have audit requirements is even if you're not a public company, if you're a private company, it could be dependent on the type of company or industry that you're in. So, for example, if you're a manufacturing company that manufactures food, one of the things that could happen is if people change recipes, it could really impact your bottom line. So you may want to actually audit those. So it's kind of up to you whether you're a public company or private company. Make sure you weigh the requirements that you have based on the type of company you are and whether you're public or private. Then the thing that you also want to consider is the cost to audit trails. There is a cost. Whether it's not just monetary. If you decide to buy a third-party tool, it's also internally there's going to be a cost. There's the time to set it up, there's the time to maintain it, and there is significant time sometimes to review it. So those are all things you want to weigh as you consider what you want to audit and what you want to set up. The other thing is the performance cost. So a little bit later, we'll go into my demo environment and we'll look at the NAV Change Log. And so far right now, the company that I'm in has 44,000 rows of data. You will notice there's a little bit of a performance lag even at 44,000 rows. So that's something that you want to take into consideration. And we'll talk a little bit more on how to manage that performance a little later as well. So when we talk about audit trail setup, one of the things that we want to do, and we always encourage our clients that we work with on audit trails, is to really take a risk-based approach. So look at the high-risk areas from your risk assessment or profile. If you have one from an auditor, you'll want to look at that. If you don't have one from an auditor, that's something you'll want to do yourselves, is just sit down and look at those areas inside your own company. And then what you want to do is really find the right balance. So it's really important to look at how much is too much information and how much is too little information. You know, it's really, you want to really focus on finding that right balance. Too much, people are not going to look at it. It's kind of like check boxes. If you put a bunch of check boxes in NAV, depending on what the information they're conveying, a lot of times people will just click through them and they just ignore them. So it's kind of the same thing with audit trails. You really want to make sure that you don't have too much information, otherwise it just gets too much to look at. And if you have too little, you may not actually see those patterns or see where there's those anomalies that you're really looking for that could raise the red flags. The next piece you want to look at is make sure that you're identifying and tracking critical data points. So when you look at NAV as a whole and when you look at your organization, what are the critical things that you need to track? So if we look at master data, you know, vendor's an easy one. That's one that's always an area of risk. So when you talk master data, you can look at the vendor records, you can look at customers, you can look at items. If you're a manufacturing company, production bombs may come into play. It just kind of depends what your company does and what is important to your company. The next thing you want to look at is security changes. So, you know, should you be tracking if people's permissions have changed? Because if somebody is, you know, maybe an accounting clerk and they deal with the vendors and now all of a sudden they have access to customers, you know, is that really what they should have access to? So you definitely want to review security changes as well. And then setups. So setup and configuration, those things kind of go together. It's one of the things that you may want to take a look at because it could affect your bottom line financially. So I used to actually work at an end user, and one of the situations that we ran into is that somebody had access to go into the general ledger setup and change the posting dates. So what happened was they noticed there was an error in the previous year, and they wanted to go try and fix it, but without talking to anybody and not really realizing that that year was already closed, they went in, reopened the posting date, posted that back to the previous year, and then set the posting date back to what it was supposed to be. And then all of a sudden, people realized, oh man, the financials changed for last year. What happened? But since we were tracking the setup changes, you know, we could tell that somebody had changed the posting date, and that's how it had happened. So those are things that you want to keep an eye on because people might not do it maliciously. They just may not really realize the impact of making some of those changes. So those are things that you may want to consider tracking as well. Then when you look at other critical data points like transactional data, again, you want to be concerned about performance and you really want to look at, is it critical to track this transactional data? Because if there's already a mechanism in place that shows you the transaction and tracks it and that you can report off of, you want to make sure that you're not doing double duty, that you're not really tracking something that's already being tracked in a different way. Then the biggest thing is really when you get down to the field level of tracking the different master data, security changes, or any of that, you really want to look at what's the least amount of fields possible that I can track. Because the more fields you track in a table, the more it's going to affect performance. The more it's going to affect data storage. And the more it's going to be generating a lot of data that you're going to have to actually go through. So you really want to make sure that when you sit down and look at those things, if you say I want to monitor the vendor records, then look at the types of fields that you'd like to audit. So for example, name is a good one, remit to address, city, state, zip, all of those things. Do you really need to actually track the fax number? Is that going to be important? So really make sure, can you set it to the least amount of fields possible? You're going to reduce your storage requirements. You're going to improve your reporting performance, and it's going to improve the accuracy in which somebody is looking at it is more likely to see something happen. So you also want to keep in mind that people have to actually look at these reports, and they're going to want to look at the least amount of information they can to get the biggest bang for their buck. The other thing that you want to do is use your reports to filter out information. So if there is, if you want to look at vendors, maybe it's important that you just view the modifications. Maybe it's important that you just view the new vendor setups. Things like that. You'll want to see how you can filter down your reports to make them easier for the reviewers to view them. And start small. So again, like we kind of talked about, identify those critical areas that you have the highest risk and start with those. Even if you start with like vendor, GL, and things like that, that'll give you somewhere small to start and you can actually start looking at the data. The other thing that you want to do is put the ownership of the product or the reports in the hands of the business process owners. And I think this is kind of an important thing to really stress here. I come from an IT background, and a lot of times these are things that get pushed to the IT department, but really the IT department is not the expert in areas of accounting. So it's really something that we wanted to partner with the business process owners to really understand, make sure that we understood what were the proper things that we should be tracking from a financial aspect. It's really critical that there is that ownership at the business level because ultimately they're the ones that are going to have to review the data as well. So that comes to my next point, review, review, review. Don't create your own haystack where you're going to have to go through and look for the needles. And don't turn on audit trails if you're not going to review it. Because at the end of the day, if you're tracking something and something bad happens and you never review it, then chances are you're not going to catch it. So performance considerations, kind of like we talked about before, is that there are some serious performance impacts that can happen with the NAV change log. Every field that you're tracking has a performance impact. So you really want to focus on narrowing down that number of fields that you're going to track. You know, instead of 100, can you get down to 10 critical? All of the tables in NAV, you know, have hundreds of fields in them. You really want to look at what are the things that matter. The other thing is it's going to have an impact on the user experience. So it's going to take time to load the more you track. It's going to take time for people to sift through all of that information. It's not a super friendly user experience to view the reports, to view the changelog entries. We'll look at that in a little bit. So you really want to make sure that your users can do something with that. And then you want to look at taking the risk-based approach. So look at what you're tracking, what's important, and then track those changes. Make sure that it's going to have either a monetary impact or an audit impact. I mean, if it's something that is going to affect your bottom line and it's something that you can audit, that's something you'll want to consider. The next thing is building a test environment. This is kind of important because once you turn on the NAV Change Log and you start tracking changes, it will affect performance. It will affect the speed at which you can retrieve that data as that audit trail grows, as the changelog entries grows. It will affect that. So if you build a test environment, run through a couple tests, run through you know, if you're tracking vendor changes, make sure you go in and change some vendors and really look at how much data is that going to generate. Really be critical, super critical, and say, do I need this field? Do I really need this field? I know some people, you know, may look at it and say, oh, well, but I might need it later. Then add it later if you really determine that you need it. Don't add it up front. Add the bare minimum up front and start with that. Then the next point is make sure you test. So you want to make sure that you're getting good streamlined data. You want to make sure you cut out all the fat and make sure that it really is making sense, the things that you're tracking. Next thing we're going to talk about is tools. We're just going to talk about really NAV Changelog is what we're going to look at the demo for today. There are some other tools out there. There's some custom things that you can do to enhance some of the NAV Changelog tracking as far as reporting. There's not really any reports out of the box, so you could add some reporting to the NAV Changelog. And then there's some other third-party tools out there that will do audit tracking as well. So then just a little bit of high level on the NAV Changelog. It's going to track the user, the date, the time, the old and new values for changes and that have been made to the data and then tables you track. And we'll look at how to set that up and turn it on. You can track specific fields within the table along with specific events. So you can track the add, modify, delete. Just a little bit of history here. From NAV 2009 to NAV 2013, there were some changes to the change log, and a big part of that was so that it could deal with the service tier. So before, in NAV 2009, it only tracked the data changes when users made changes in the NAV user interface. 2013 is going to track all changes, whether by the user or not. So anything that would come in through the service tier as well is going to get tracked. One caveat with the NAV changelog is it's only going to track things that happen inside of NAV. It is not going to track things at a SQL level. So that's a different discussion, but it's one thing that you will want to consider, and you will want to make sure that when you're looking at security, you're also looking at who has access to your SQL environment as well. And then we'll just kind of look at some quick screenshots here of the NAV changelog setup. We're actually going to go into the system and take a look at it. I just wanted to include it in the slides so everyone would have it. To activate the changelog, it is activated per company. So there is the changelog setup window. You go in and you activate it there. And then what you would do is go into the actual tables and then set up the tables you want to track, including the fields for each table. And then just kind of shows selecting the fields and the event types. And let's go ahead and jump over and just take a quick look at how that happens. So I am going to demo in 2016 today. It is pretty similar to 2015 and 2013. So we'll just go in here to change log. So first thing we're going to look at is change log setup. So you can see I have my change log activated. I'm going to go into actions here. I'm going to go into tables. And I'm going to go to the top of my list here. So what you'll notice is you have listed all of the tables available in NAV for auditing. Right now I've turned on the GL account, the customer vendor. So if we just look at the first one here, the GL account, if I click here, what you can see is what I have turned on. Oh, notice I forgot to click one there. But so what I have turned on is name, account type, direct posting, reconciliation account, and you have to turn these on for each thing. So each of the log insert, whether you're going to log the insertion, the modify, or delete, you have to go in and check each of these boxes for it. So let's go ahead and let's set up a new one. So I'm going to go into item. I'm going to say some fields. I would definitely recommend never ever select all fields unless it's a extremely small table with maybe 5 fields in it. But other than that, you're always going to want to go in and really take a hard look at the different fields and really decide what it is that you would like to track. So here, you'll notice since I went into the first one where I said I was going to log the insert, I only get one column here. So I only get to select what I want to track on insertion. So I'm going to say number, say description, maybe you use description 2, say base unit measure. Just gonna select a couple here, maybe unit price, unit cost, those types of things. So I'm gonna say okay there. Now if I want to actually log if anybody makes any changes to the items as well, I would need to go into some fields, and now you'll notice I get the option for the modification, and you can just kind of select those as well. And then the last one would be the deletion. And again, just kind of go in and select those as well. Okay. And then if we just kind of take a quick look at vendor, because that is one that you probably will want to track or set an audit trail on, really be critical of the different fields here and what makes sense for you to track. And really make sure that it has some sort of could have some sort of financial impact on it. Again, do you really need to track like phone number? Maybe not. Somebody changes the phone number, that's not as likely to raise a red flag as if somebody changes an address. So just keep those things in mind. All right. And let's just jump back to the presentation here. So some of the pitfalls, I want to audit everything. It can be very tempting, to really kind of adopt that approach because you want to make sure you have the data just in case you need it, but it really can cause some bad things to happen. I like to always say, just because I can do something doesn't mean I should do something. And that might have been a big motto when I was growing up because I did get in trouble a lot. But it served me well in my professional career as well. So really keep this in mind that maybe when you're talking with users and when you're having the conversations with the business process owners, you really want to help them understand that the audit trail is not going to help prevent changes. You have to really control your security as well. So really picking those high-risk areas in your organization to audit is going to be critical to the success of actually auditing something. don't use Audit Trail to address security issues. You know, if somebody is doing something and you're not sure how they're doing it, you can turn it on as a troubleshooting tool, but don't leave that on for that purpose. You know, make sure you turn it on, you find out who's changing a value, and you turn it back off. Because otherwise then it kind of waters down what it is that you're actually auditing. You know, make sure that you're doing a segregation of duties review. Make sure you're doing reviews of who has permissions to what, and that you have the proper security set up. And then once you have proper security set up, the audit trail is really going to help you monitor those high-risk areas, and it's really going to help you see when you actually have a problem. So, you know, sifting through millions and millions of rows, if you turn on and take the approach if I want to audit everything, you could really go, you know, you could really go cross-eyed trying to look through that. Make sure that you don't fall into the temptation of using audit trail reports as a substitute for operation and financial reports. So if you can get the same information out of an operational or finance report, make sure you're using that for that purpose. You know, tracking journal entries down to credits and debits, you know, you could be recreating the journal posting reports with audit trails, and that is not a good thing. You know, make sure that audit trails are used for auditing things, and reports are used for what they're designed to do, which is report on the financials. The other thing that you want to do is use audit trails to understand critical data, critical changes to critical data. That should be the purpose of audit trails. It's going to be key to keep that in mind as you're designing them. You know, audit trails very inefficient at reports. If you have good security, you don't really have to use audit trails for operational and financial reports. You really want to look at the things that matter for reports versus what you want to keep an eye on as the things that you're auditing that you want to keep an eye on. For example, if you're auditing changes to vendors, that's going to be really something that you can look at and say, okay, I'm only tracking these 10 fields. I can really see that I have an issue here. Why? Last week I had, you know, maybe 5 vendors that got set up. This week I had 20 vendors that got set up. And some of these, you know, addresses look a little weird. They're like P.O. boxes or things like that. So you really want to make sure that you can give users an easy way to look at the reports in Audit Trail. The other point I want to make is that, you know, when you're looking at the information that an audit trail is going to generate, it's much easier to look at 500 rows versus a million. You know, it's easier to find issues when you're looking at a smaller subset of data. So keep that in mind. The next point that you want to consider is, what do you do with the data? So again, like we kind of talked about before, make sure that you review the data. Make sure that you know who should be reviewing that data. You know, you don't want the person that can make the changes to review the data. You want to make sure it's somebody independent, but it still has responsibility that the data is appropriate. And in a smaller organization, that might be hard. So it might be really hard to say, you know, I have only 3 people in my accounting department. You know, who's going to own reviewing the data if they're not the person that's making the changes? So those are going to be key things to take a look at. The other thing is, you want to make sure that reviews are done in a timely fashion. This is key. You know, if no one looks at a log for 4 to 5 or 6 weeks, it's not going to be easy to identify the user or see that you had an issue. You know, by the time that you look at it, there's a lot of money that could have been lost in that 4 to 5, 6 week period. So you really want to make sure that you are reviewing that data either, you know, weekly, every couple days. Whatever you determine is appropriate for your organization is going to be what's going to be key. And then making sure that you're documenting the reviews as well. So it's important as well to make sure that the reviews are done, and that they're documented, so you can say, you know, we were reviewing it on a regular basis, and you can prove to auditors that it was being reviewed. The next thing you want to keep in mind when you're working with the data is the visibility. So who, what, where, when, how. You know, did the right person make the change? Did I know that person had this type of access? So again, going back to the example of if somebody is in customer service and all of a sudden they now have access to change a GL account, you know, how did that person get that access? And should they really have that access? Also, where did the change come from? So was it in the system or outside of the system? Again, going back to knowing who has access not only into Navision, but also into your database as well is critical. And then when was that change made? So was it made during business hours, or were there a lot of changes that got made on non-business hours? That's another key indicator that you can look at. And then this is just an example of the change log entries page, but we're going to go ahead and go into the database and take a quick look at that as well. And some of the things that you can kind of do there to help you look at that data. So we'll just switch over here real quick. So I'm going to close out of here. And we're going to look at the change log entries. So as you can see here, this is my change log entries. So this is the data that the change log has generated so far. There are there's about 44,000 rows in this company of changes that have been tracked. So you can see here, I made some changes to the vendors. You can see it's going to show you the date and time, the user ID. Let me make this a little bigger here. So you can see I changed the vendor. This is the primary key for that vendor. So vendor 30,000, the address to field was modified. And there was, oh, sorry about that. There was no old value, and there is now a new value of Suite 100. One of the things that you want to do is this is a little hard to kind of read. You'll notice there's some additional fields here. For most things, you won't need to see these additional primary keys unless it is, for example, like this, where it is the change log setup. So it automatically will track where I turned on, what I turned on to track and the fields that I turned on. So one of the things that you can do to help your users is have them narrow down the columns that they're actually seeing. So like new value local, I usually take these out. So I just want to see one old value, one new value. Maybe I want to move up the type of change so it's a little easier to see. I'm going to take out these two, and then I'm going to say OK. And when I do that, it's a little easier to kind of work with the screen and kind of see what my data is that's here. The other thing that you may want to do is create some saved filters so that it makes it a little easier for users to work with as well. So for example, if I want to go in and add, say I just want to save a filter for vendors. So I'm going to select table caption. And I'm going to select that equal to vendor. And I'm going to say, I'm going to add an additional one for type of change. And I just want to save one that just shows the modifications, for example. So I'm going to set my filters. Now you'll notice that the information I'm dealing with in the screen is a lot less. And then I can actually save that filter so I can run it later. And I think I already have one, but I'm just going to say 2. Let's say OK. It's going to restart. And now you notice I have one here, my change log entries. And I see I can spell vendor really well there, so please ignore my spelling. That's what happens when I type and talk. But so you'll notice here, now I have this and I can run this, I can come into NAV, I can run this on a regular basis where I could actually look at this. The other thing that you can do too is, if you'll notice here, the customer one takes a little bit longer to come back. So, you know, you'll notice that it just kind of depends on which one you're running, you know, with the save filters on the different types. So here I didn't actually filter down to modifications, and I don't know if that's what's doing it. But you notice there's already starting to be a little bit of a delay when it's retrieving those entries. And that delay will start getting more and more as the change log entries grows. So one of the things you can do to manage that and help manage that is you can actually delete change log entries. So there is a report that you can run that will go out and delete the change log entries. So this is something obviously you'll want to filter down. If there's information you would like to save out of here, you'll want to export that information, maybe save it somewhere before you delete it. Kind of is up to you how you want to have that data retention policy. And we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more. So let me jump back to my slides. So data maintenance is a very critical piece of this whole thing as well. A lot of times people will turn on audit trails and they will forget to manage the data. And so what happens is your data grows and grows, your performance starts to suffer, and then you'll start managing it. If you're going to turn on audit trails, it's a good idea to decide what your data maintenance policy will be before you actually turn on the audit trails. So it's kind of subjective on how much data is going to be created. I mean, because it's really going to depend on what you're auditing and the size of your organization as to how much data and how quickly that's going to grow. Normally what we say is 1 million rows of data equates to about a gig of size. So you're going to add a gig of size to your database per 1 million rows of data that you're tracking as in an audit trail through the NAV Change Log. The other thing that you want to do as well is define your retention policy. Again, define that up front. If you're auditing things and it's not subject to, if you're not a private company or you're not subject to an audit, you know, it may not have the same requirements as, you know, financial and operational data. Just make sure you check with your internal and external auditors first to determine what that retention policy needs to be. And then archiving is going to improve your report performance. So again, if you can archive rows, you'll have to do that manually, but you're going to have to move the audit data from reporting tables, you know, create an archive table somewhere, database or server, and then have the ability to restore from there. That is something you will have to do manually. It's something you'll have to kind of decide if that's, you know, makes sense for you. The other part is make sure you purge data on a regular basis. So again, if you don't need to retain it for, you know, financial or operational requirements, make sure you are getting rid of that data. So, you know, can you do it every year? Can you do it every 2 years? Or is it every 3 years? Just make sure you decide on what that is going to be. And then make sure that you're watching, you know, how quickly your database is growing, and make sure that you're watching that size so that you can really make sure that your performance is pretty quick for your reporting and reviewers that need to look at that data. And then always, as always, make a backup. Obviously, if you're using the NAV Change Log, it's going to get backed up on a regular basis as part of the NAV backup. But if you do archive some of that information, make sure that you're backing up that as well. And then kind of what we were talking about before, the screen that I showed you, the NAV change log, deleting entries. Make sure that you filter what entries based on date or table number or however you would like to do that. Again, that'll be something that you'll want to make sure you run on a regular basis and really have a good retention policy for that as well. And it looks like we are at the question slide. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Kim, and please do use that Q&A block you should see to the right of the main slide area there to ask your questions. One thing to maybe get things started, Kim, that I was curious about, when you look at the folks who took the quick poll question at the beginning, a lot of people on 2013 or older versions who are on this call, are there any considerations about sort of maintaining audit records when you're also planning perhaps an upgrade at some point in the future?
Yeah, I think, so that's always a really good question, because especially if you're upgrading, the more data you bring over, the more you have to work with. It's kind of the same with when you're trying to make that decision, do I bring over history, do I bring over starting balances? If you can still report off of that old version, I recommend bringing over the least amount possible. I mean, obviously, if there's financial implications that you have to keep things for 3 years or 7 years, it's kind of, do you have the staff internally that can pull reports from the old database and marry them up to the new database as well? So that's usually what we use to kind of look at and say, should I bring this data forward, or can I leave it here so I can just report from both places? So just kind of what makes sense for your organization.
Okay, great. We just put up something in that media viewer panel. If anyone wants to request a follow-up very quickly, you can just fill that out. Obviously, it's totally optional. Another question that came in, Kim, can you give us an example of interpretation of a change log entry?
Interpretation of a change log entry. So I would say, the big thing is on the change log entries is what you're really looking at is you're trying to see, is somebody entering information that they shouldn't enter. So, my interpretation of the change log is that, it's something you need to review on a regular basis. And then kind of saying, okay, if somebody changed this address, should it really have been changed? Is somebody adding vendors on a regular basis that it seems like maybe they shouldn't have access to that and be entering vendors? I don't know if that answered the question.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. It's asking, do administrators have the ability to delete audit logs?
Yes, they do. So if you have access to the administration area in NAV, you would have access to that report.
All right. Next question, have you been able to filter on the date field in the change log? I noticed you put a date filter on the report. I found that since it's a date time field, it doesn't accept date only as a filter.
Yeah, that's true. It is kind of a little goofy. That way, sometimes I can get it to do the less than or greater to. And then it's almost like it kind of puts 12 o'clock in there.
All right.
But yeah, if you do equal to a date, it won't.
I want to make a final call for questions here. We have one more in the queue at this point. Is there a way to see changes that are done directly by users and not indirect updates? For example, changes to the last direct cost changes to the last direct cost are automatically updated by posting routine, but the field can also be updated directly by a user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, No, it will capture that as well. If you have that set to track, it will capture that as well.
Okay, well, that would appear to wrap up our questions here. Thank you, everyone, for those. Please be on the lookout for a quick survey as well that will pop up after the event. We really appreciate just a few seconds of feedback to tell us about your experience today and what you thought of the event. Both our speakers and we at MSTW really appreciate understanding that. So we have recorded today's event. We'll be making that available, so please look for an update there. Kim, thank you so much for taking the time to present today and for answering all those questions.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, agreed. And thanks to everyone in the audience as well. We are going to wrap it up there. Have a great day, everyone.